In this video, we will be covering the female reproductive system. The female reproductive system is made up of internal and external sex organs that function in reproduction. So in humans, the female reproductive system is immature at birth, and it develops to maturity at puberty to be able to produce gametes and to be able to carry a baby to full term. So we will be looking at not only the anatomical structures of the female reproductive system, we will be looking at the formation of gametes through meiosis, and finally we'll be looking at how the female body is designed in order to hold a developing embryo until birth. With that said, the female reproductive system is much more complex since it not only produces and delivers gametes and hormones, but it also nourishes and nurtures a developing embryo. The functions of the female reproductive system includes producing the female gamete, the ovum or the oocyte. It provides a site for fertilization, implantation, pregnancy, and delivery. It also is a means of nourishing the baby, and it produces several female hormones. Looking at the female reproductive system, just to get you oriented, right here is the pubic symphysis of the pelvic bone. Right here we have the large intestines, specifically the rectum of the large intestines. Right here we have the bladder, and we have the urethra. Now above, this is the ovaries. The ovaries are paired. There's one on each side. They are held together or held to the uterus by the ovarian ligament. Coming up and around, this right here is the fimbriae. Now this does not directly touch the ovaries. There's a gap and there's a suction that pulls the egg once ovulation has occurred and the egg has been released by the ovary. It will be pulled up through air suction into the fimbriae, and then it will pass through the fallopian tube around until it reaches the uterus. Right here we have the uterus. The opening is the cervix. Right here we have the vagina. We have the labium major and minor. Here's minor, here's major. The clitoris is right here. And so we're going to be looking at the functions of these structures as we go through. Now, to hold the uterus in place, there is a ligament called the broad ligament. Let's start off by discussing the ovaries. The ovaries are paired gonads that are on either side. They're suspended to the uterus by two ligaments. The ovarian ligament anchors the ovaries to the uterus. I mentioned that one on the previous slide. And then the suspensory ligaments anchors the ovaries to the pelvic wall. The broad ligament, again, is the ligament that holds the uterus and the tubes in place. The outer layer of the ovary is called the germinal epithelium, and inside it is the tunica albuginea. Inside of the ovary is where oogenesis occurs. Oogenesis is the formation of the oocyte, which is the gamete for females. Within the ovary, there's many sac-like structures called ovarian follicles. Each of the follicles consists of an immature ovum or oocyte. That's the egg, and it is surrounded by cells. These cells that are surrounding the oocyte are called follicle cells. Depending upon the layer of these follicle cells, that will tell us what stage of development the oocyte is at. If there's only one layer of follicle cells, then it is the primary follicle. If there are two or more layers of cells, these cells are now called the granulosa, then we have a secondary follicle. The mature follicle or Graafian follicle is when we have many layers of follicles, but we also have a fluid-filled space called an antrum. Now the granulosa cells are now producing hormones for the body. So here we have the inside of the ovary, and we've got our primary follicles here. So right inside there we would have our oocyte, and then right here on the outside we have one layer of cells, so that's the primary follicle. When we get over to these and over here, you're going to see that we have more than 2 layers, 2 or more layers, and that becomes the secondary follicle. Now once we start getting this fluid filled area here, then we've moved to the Graafian follicle, and the oocyte is right there. Now that will continue to enlarge until it is finally ruptured, at which time it releases the egg, and that's called ovulation. So that each month one mature follicle will rupture, releasing the oocyte, called ovulation. Now when this ruptured follicle has released that oocyte, it's going to change into a glandular body called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will produce hormones for about 10 days, and then it will degenerate or break down. Now here we have an actual microscope slide of a primary follicle, and we can see that we have that primary oocyte here. We know this is a primary follicle because we see one cell layer right in this area. So primary follicle, not ready to be released. All of the cells will be, the oocytes will be frozen at this primary oocyte level until puberty. And then at puberty, one cell each month will be released, and it will go through to the secondary follicle, and then to the mature follicle, and then be released through ovulation. Now this is the secondary follicle because we could see that there are 2 or more layers. Again, the oocyte would still be located right here in the center. That secondary oocyte would continue to grow, and then a fluid-filled space would form, and that's the antrum. We can see the oocyte is right here. Again, this will rupture about midway through the cycle for the woman. The oocyte will be released by the ovaries. That's called ovulation. It will then be picked up by the fimbriae and then moved through the fallopian tube to the uterus. And so here you can see the ovary, we can see the ovulation, and we can see how the oocyte is released, picked up by the fimbriae, and then we can see how it moves to the path where it would reach the uterus. Fertilization typically happens in the fallopian tube, and then once you have the egg and sperm together, it's called a zygote, and that zygote is what would be carried over, and then you would have implantation, and you would have the stages of development that you will see on video 3 of this series. Now in males, sperm production begins at puberty, and it generally will continue until death. In females, the oogonium divides by mitosis. It produces those primary oocytes, and then they're enclosed by that primordial follicle, and this happens when mom is 3 months pregnant with the little girl. And so this is going on in the little girl, the embryo's body, before she's ever born. And it's going to stay that way until the female goes into puberty. So that after ovulation, the mature follicle becomes the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum begins to secrete hormones. It will continue to secrete hormones if the egg is fertilized and implanted into the uterus. If the egg is not fertilized and is not implanted into the uterus, the corpus luteum will begin to disintegrate. The oocyte is ovulated into the peritoneal cavity, which is the gap between the ovary and the fimbriae of the fallopian tubes. It is then guided into the fallopian tube. Another word for fallopian tube is uterine tube, by a fluid current that's produced by the fimbriae. We describe it like being like a wet, dry vacuum suction system. The fallopian tube doesn't actually connect to the ovary, and there's a gap, and this gap creates the possibility of infections such as gonorrhea spreading into the peritoneal cavity. If you've heard of an ectopic pregnancy, this refers to implantation of the zygote, the fertilized egg, someplace other than the uterus. It's usually in the fallopian tube or the infundibulum, but it's possible that it could occur outside in the peritoneal cavity as well. Now, this is not a situation that will lead to a successful pregnancy, and so the pregnancy has to be terminated because the developing embryo, one, you're not going to have a placenta formed, and two, it could rupture the tubing and cause risk for the mother as well. The uterus is the site of the menstrual cycle. It's the site of implantation and development of the embryo, becoming the fetus as it develops further, and of labor. There are 3 layers of the uterus. The perimetrium is the outer layer. It's also called the visceral layer. The myometrium is the middle thick layer of the uterus. This is the layer of smooth muscle that contracts, goes through contractions during labor. The endometrium is the mucous membrane layer. It's made up of 2 sublayers, and this is the layer that is affected when an individual has endometriosis. These sublayers of the endometrium are the stratum functionalis. Now, this right here is the layer that's shed during the menstrual cycle, and then the stratum basalis, which is the permanent layer, and this regenerates the functionalis each cycle. The endometrium is highly vascularized, and this is the layer where the embryo will burrow into, and this is the layer that will create the placenta. So here we're looking at a slide of the uterus, and you can see the perimetrium, or that outer layer here. We can see the myometrium, or middle layer here, and then we can see the endometrium, which is this layer here. Now, it's that inner layer that's going to be shed during the menstrual cycle. It's also going to be in this area here where you would have that fertilized egg, that zygote, would implant into the uterus, and then you would start to have a placenta formed, and then the continuation of the pregnancy. So here we have a diagram where you can see the locations of the ovaries. You can see the fimbriae, the fallopian or uterine tube, how it passes straight over to the uterus. So you can see the uterus. The endometrial layer is labeled, the cervix being the opening to the uterus, and then the vagina. So the extension from the cervix is the vagina, and it leads to outside the body. This is the passageway for menstrual flow. It's the receptacle for copulation, and it's the birth canal. The pH of the vagina is low. It's acidic at 3.5. It's at 3.5 to retard microbial growth and infection. If the pH becomes off balance, then an individual could have a yeast infection. Near the external opening of the uterus may be an extension of the vaginal lining, and this borders around and partially closes that opening, and this is called the hymen. The external genitalia of the female is called the vulva. It consists of the labium minor and major. These are the folds of adipose tissue. They surround the vaginal opening. And then there's the clitoris, which is the erectile tissue that's surrounded by folds of skin called prepuce. The mammillary glands are present in both males and females. However, they remain undeveloped in males, and they remain undeveloped in females until high levels of progesterone and estrogen at puberty cause them to begin to develop. They are modified sudoriferous glands. The hormone progesterone helps to prepare the endometrium for implantation. It helps with the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle. It helps prepare breast milk for secretion, and it stops water retention. The function of estrogen is for protein synthesis, to control the electrolyte balance, to promote the follicle growth, moving from primary follicle to secondary follicle to mature follicle. It stimulates the development and maintenance of the female reproductive structures, secondary sex characteristics such as breast development, fat distribution, causing the pelvis to widen, causes pubic hairs to form. The menstrual cycle is composed of 3 phases. The menstrual phase is called menesis, and if we look at this being a 30-day cycle, day 1 through 5 would be the menstrual cycle. This is due to drops in those ovarian hormones. So what happens is that thickened functionalis layer that was ready for an embryo to implant is now shed along with blood and interstitial fluids. The primary follicles will begin to develop into the secondary ones. The second phase is called the proliferative phase. This is days 6 through 14. The estrogen levels will begin to rise and become the dominant hormone. The endometrium is repaired and regenerated. The secondary follicle is becoming the Graafian follicle, and on day 14, ovulation occurs in response to a surge in a hormone called luteinizing hormone. The secretory phase is the third phase. This is days 15 through 28. Progesterone levels rise and become the dominant hormone. It's preparing the uterine lining for implantation. If no fertilization, the corpus luteum will break down. Progesterone levels will fall. They deprive the endometrium of hormone support. Starts the stages all over. So, when one is looking at why the girls are cranky 1 week of a month, look at all of these hormones that are rising and falling throughout the 3 cycles, and you can see that that does put a lot of stress on an individual, especially a teenager going through this for the first times. So here we have just a diagram that shows you the stages and what's going on, and a description of what's going on with each of the stages. That's followed by this chart here, which is showing you the surges of luteinizing hormone and how it's associated with ovulation. And now we can see a follicle stimulating hormone and how that works as well. Not to mention that we have progesterone and estrogen levels rising as well. And unfortunately, let's see, does this have everything labeled? It does not show the estrogen and the progesterone rising and falling, but you will get to see that in your upcoming lab. And so you can see that there is a very small window of time in which an egg can be fertilized. And so we have to look at changes in estrogen level, changes in body temperature, and learning to determine the follicular cycle of an individual and when they ovulate. If implantation does occur, the corpus luteum is then prompted by the embryo through hormones to continue producing hormones for about 3 months. And then the placenta would then take over the hormone secretions. And you'll see what happens with all of this on video 3 of the series.